So what I'm going to be talking about is a topic that might be a little bit curious and certainly a bit controversial to discuss in relation to children's clothing concerns, particularly of today's theme, but also the network generally. So children's undress is what I'm talking about today, and particularly in relation to the theme of the workshop, which in the kind of set of questions that you put together was about the display and usage of dress. This is perhaps seems like an immaterial practice. So it might seem like it's a dress history without things, without artifacts. But I would argue, and I have argued in some writing that I've done on the topic, undress is always a form of dress, I think. So it's always related to its opposite other, which is, of course, clothing. And this claim has particular pertinence in relation to the clothing of children in the nudist movement, or sometimes called the naturist movement, especially in its interwar years when it first emerged in Britain. At that time, nudism's most vocal performers and most vocal participants were, interestingly, dress reformers and fashion writers. And they had strong opinions about dress in general, and also in nudism, psychologists, physicians, educators with interests in children's dress were a key part of the early movement. And also I would say as well that the historic sources that are left behind for researchers to consult in relation to nudism are all also about display. So there were many copiously illustrated publications, and they formed a kind of nudist visual culture. So today what I'm going to do is three things. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of context to what nudism was in relation to dress, and in particular dress in children. I'm then going to look at some particular examples of how that manifested in education. So progressive schools were places where children's nudism was put into practice. And then I'm finally going to end with some thoughts about what the implications might be for thinking about children's dress more broadly, and children's undress as well, 100 years on. And I want to give a content warning because I'm going to show photographs of naked children. They're all out of historical context, and they should be understood in those historical contexts. None of them are explicit. All of them are over 70 years old, and they're all in the public domain. But let's understand that they're coming from particular historic context, so in nudist culture, in news articles, and in educational texts. So to talk through a little bit of the context, nudism as a modern movement with clubs and literature and manifestos, in fact, began in Britain in quite a small way in the early 1920s. It was led by small groups of experimental thinkers and social reformers, and they tended to be internationally minded intellectuals, and they were inspired by the German pioneers who had gone before them, who had been promoting sunbathing as part of a programme of natural health cures for self-realisation, for social betterment and beyond since the end of the 19th century. The British manifestations were slower to take hold, and they were also quite a bit smaller and more tentative, but basically throughout the 1920s, independent clubs began to emerge. Men, women and children started to meet together in the nude, often on private plots of land that had been bought by enthusiasts and then developed into small-scale commercial operations. And then alongside those practices, a set of literature emerged, so books and magazines started to appear from the late 1920s. They promoted the practice, they explained it, and they also provided it with a philosophical base. And as nudism's progenitors in England were intellectuals, were these kind of elite intellectuals, they were physicians and psychologists, they were health reformers and educationalists, they were artists and writers. These early nudist books and early nudist publications are quite serious and scholarly projects. Now, from the start, clothes were absolutely at the centre of discussion, which I find really interesting. So Gymnos magazine was the first British newsstand magazine for the British nudist movement, and it came out in February 1933, and it mentioned clothes on the very first line of its very first issue. they said, "Our clothes lie behind us. We are facing the light, naked and unashamed. In the garb of nature we address you." This is quite typical for the language of these sorts of publications, quite evangelical. So clothes formed this kind of focal point for discussion, even though, of course, most nudists wanted to live without them, wanted to reject them. And as a result, early nudists produced these kind of interesting, complicated, quite sophisticated discussions about fashion and its discontents. And that is not least because some of the prominent writers for these magazines were the major fashion writers and fashion historians of the time. So on the left, you can see J.C. Flugel, who is the author of 1930s The Psychology of Clothes. And on the right, James Laver, V&A curator and author of the very popular Taste and Fashion from 1937. These men were both nudists. They were regular contributors to nudist publications, and in particular to a magazine called Sunbathing Review. And this magazine featured children very prominently as both discussion subjects and as subjects for photographs. So here I'm showing you the very first issue of that magazine, Sunbathing Review, and the unclothed or the lightly clothed child absolutely takes centre stage. So the cover woodcut, which is by artist Robert Gibbings, has got this naked child in the foreground, and the opening adverts contained a half-page promotion for a school called Pinehurst in Surrey, which featured naked children sitting on a garden gate. And the opening image, which is on the right in this slide, had a group of young women dressed only in underwear lifting a child aloft almost in adulation, who's also dressed only in knickers. And the opening article, which was entitled "Wake Up England," urged readers to take action now for the benefit of our children. And in fact, children appear on almost every page of the first issue. Now, Sunbathing Review didn't include nudism in the title. Gymnos did not include nudism in the title. That was partly to kind of moderate nudism's acceptability to a broader public culture. But in the case of Sunbathing Review, they also had a policy that they didn't necessarily advocate total nudity at all times. It was possible to partake of the benefits of sunbathing while still being lightly dressed, as they described it, in so-called slips. But nonetheless, there are naked bodies of children from the very first issue, particularly this article about sunbathing in Germany, where the so-called bleached English boys are compared negatively to the bronzed Germans. And this is a very sort of typical discussion. That first issue also included an article called "Clothes and the Growing Girl." And the author was Mary G. Cardwell, and she was representing a conventional view, I quote, "An inadequately clad girl mixing with boys and men in the unrestrained way of modern times is living in the midst of grave peril. This highly moral concern about men and women and boys and girls mixing naked together." But as Sunbathing Review advocated lighter clothing for children and adults, they called on one of their key authors to reply, and that was Dr. Kathleen Vaughan. And she wrote an article which by then was reaching some 50,000 readers, because these magazines had huge readerships. She was a physician who had particular interest in childbirth and in pelvic bone health. And she argued that in girls' clothes, there must be no overclothing and no wrapping up. No black stockings, there should be short skirts and no stockings. And she lamented that even such a wonderful movement as the Girl Guides is entirely spoilt by its dreadful Victorian clothing, which she described as a cross between the Salvation Army and a policewoman. And there were images used throughout Sunbathing Review to kind of visualise this kind of transformation that was meant to occur from the overclothed child to the lightly clad or naked child. And so her discussion was about girls in the main, but she also said that boys must dispense with collars, ties, +4s, waistcoats, and flannel shirts. And this was an almost direct echo of contemporaneous concerns by the Men's Dress Reform Party, who were another campaigning group who were prominent contributors to nudist literature. So this idea that children should be dressed in fewer clothes was repeatedly illustrated in the magazines, and it was a health concern in that context. So The 1920s and 30s, of course, were a period when clothes were coming under intense scrutiny for adults as well as children, as part of a general post-war shift in cultural attitudes to formality, as well as greater knowledge of the health benefits of exposing the body to sun and air, and a lot of that literature was contained in those magazines. So to some extent, those matters extended to children just as a corollary of what was seen to be good for adults, but they also overlapped because social nudism, as opposed to sexual nudity, was always intended to be a family affair. So nudist parents brought their nudist children to camp, and there were nudist events specifically for children in schools. So that's part of the fact that those who proposed nudism as part of a kind of system of cultural betterment were doing it as part of a much wider system of life reform. So they tended to be people who ate raw food. They were vegetarians or vegans or sometimes even fruitarians. They had lots of new ways of dressing, eating, living, loving, and their experimental project tended to extend to their whole families, including how their children were educated and where they went to school. And so this meant that nudism became part of a programme of progressive education and so-called modern schooling, which was flourishing at the same time. Small, independent, parent-led schools. They were often led by nudist enthusiasts, and they often advertised in the nudist magazines, and they wrote articles too about their policies and their practices. And these were partly as a form of recruitment. And I'm showing you a couple of examples here from the magazine, and I'll quote for one, an advert for Brickwall Northiam in Sussex. In their advert, worried magazine readers by asking, where are your children at school? Are they being educated by men and women who share your point of view? So there was a sort of tension between this kind of world that the nudists wanted to create and the outside world. So these kinds of schools, these small-scale independent progressive schools, were often led and formed by the discontented products of the public school system in England, and they were everything that it was not. So they were small-scale, child-centred, co-educational and open air. Sometimes in experimental, well, always in experimental educations, traditional school uniforms were anathema. So all that formality and that hierarchy that we might associate with school uniform was condemned, and alternatives instead should support the movement of children's bodies and allow for exploration. So this might mean wearing kind of simple woven shirts and shorts for boys, or one-piece knee-length dresses for girls. And in some schools that promoted handicraft for artistic expression and for self-reliance, the children might even weave the cloth and make the clothes themselves. But in these kinds of schools, quite commonly, clothing was also optional. So progressive schools, this is an image from Pinehouse School, claimed to stand for absolute freedom. In the words of the head of Rockland School, he said, I quote, "We take our clothes off just as we take all other repressions off." And Dora Russell of Beacon Hill School argued that children's clothes were indignities imposed by arbitrary adult rule, and she promoted removing children's clothes for various physical reasons. She cited benefits to muscles. She said these came when the body is free from the weight of clothes, but she also attributed various psychological benefits to children not wearing clothes, and that included peace and contentment for children who are inclined to be strung up and nervous. Those are her words. And she noted, however, that stripping off was never enforced, as the school was a democracy that gave children a share in the organisation. And that idea of self-governance by children and non-assertion by adults was a cardinal principle of many progressive schools. And the head of Brickwall School said, therefore, children could go about wearing anything or nothing as they so wished. So some nudists had been inspired to educate their children in this way by reading their children's own preferences or observing their children's own preferences. So one example in this mould is the anti-censorship campaigner Alec Craig, who was a very keen nudist, a writer for nudist magazines. He felt that clothing was unnatural and artificial, and he said these were the kinds of strictures to which children were being forcibly broken in. And he had been inspired to take that attitude and indeed to participate in nudism initially because of his young daughter's attitude to putting on a bathing suit. And that first led him to nudism as a social cause. But for many others, they had professional interests in health or psychology or education, and these were often inspired by Freud and his sexological interlocutors, who at the time were pointing towards childhood as the site where neuroses would be acquired. And in particular, a touch point for many of these progressive educators was Havelock Ellis's studies in the psychology of sex, which was a study that had first been published in 1910. And Havelock Ellis had considered both children's attitudes to nakedness, but also the value of nakedness in education. And many of the things he recommended were put into practice in those schools. So he said, I quote, "The free contact of the naked body with air and water and light makes for the health of the body. Familiarity with the sight of the body abolishes petty pruriencies, trains the sense of beauty, and makes for the health of the soul." Now, he was specifically talking about children in that context, but those were the kinds of principles that underpinned nudism more generally at the time. Ellis's ideas were taken up by Norman Hare, who was the president of the World League of Sexual Reform, and he formed his career really on the inspiration of Ellis's work. And he became a very high-profile teacher in the 1920s, a speaker on sex education matters. And he argued, quote, "If parents are desirous of bringing up their children with a sane outlook on sex, then surely the first step is to refrain from making any mystery of the appearance of the human body as regards children and adults." So progressive educationalists sort of took up and ran with those ideas. And I'm showing you some images here from Priory Gate School, where children not only swam naked in a river, but also posed as life models in art classes for their fellow students. They also undertook naked exercise in all weathers to foster what they called hardihood, this kind of ability to kind of make yourself sort of tough and strong. And that latter practice was a really popular sort of precondition of a lot of progressive education, and it drew on the ideas of G. Stanley Hall, who had this very influential theory from his book about adolescence called recapitulation, which is a totally flawed idea, I should say, but it argued that children reached full social development only by reenacting twice behaved behaviour, or kind of recapitulating, as he put it, all the stages of cultural evolution, which he saw as being mapped on this linear line from cultural savage to sort of cultural sophisticated. That's the white Westerner up here. It's deeply problematic. But that idea that children were somehow kind of close to savages manifested itself in a lot of nudism's primitivist visions. They often drew inspiration from this idea of something that had been lost with civilization, something that we needed to return to. And children were seen to be temperamentally and intellectually close to that kind of imagined savage. Children's nakedness could also be grafted onto enduring romantic ideas of childhood as a state of innocence, and that also mapped well onto nudism more generally, which was always talking about paradise, Garden of Eden type discussions. James Laver, who, as I noted before, was a fashion writer at the time, considered children to be natural nudists. Still dressed in their birthday suits, they were imagined to be nearer the beginnings of life and therefore unsullied by culture. So the irony of that attitude, or those attitudes, of course, is that it emphasises how much childhood is culturally produced and how much childhood is historically contingent. So children are always the repositories of the projections of adult others, and perhaps it's just more visible in nudism. And it's certainly illuminating to think in this way about how children were used in the movement, how they operated as kind of cultural propaganda for a movement that's just finding its feet, really. And Labour explicitly described them as the best advocates of the modern movement. So children who featured in nudist publications were not only the offspring of nudists, they also served symbolic functions. They became kind of authenticators of nudism's non-sexual principles. they became kind of ciphers for freedom and liberation. And that explains in some ways their abundant appearance in nudist magazines. In 1946, a reader to Sunbathing Review counted 36 images of children in the previous issue. He said they outnumbered adults by 4-1 in the photographs, and that was not representative of their distribution in nudist clubs. And the editor said, well, it's partly to do with the fact that high-quality photographs of adult subjects are not commonly available. Many nudists did not want to be depicted, but he also acknowledged their principal purifying function. The preponderance of child studies, he said, is due to the fact that we are anxious to encourage the family aspect of sunbathing. So nudist camps were always meant to be these non-sexual spaces, but they were at the same time spaces for sexual re-education, and this is a bit of a kind of conflict in theory. So Norman Hare said that he hoped that exhibitionists and peeping toms would be sent to nudist camps as a form of punishment instead of going to prison. Such was the power of sexual re-education. That proposition never came to pass, much to the relief of many nudist members who didn't want their clubs to be used in that way. But nonetheless, there was little acknowledgement in that kind of atmosphere of sort of sexual re-education that their sites might also be locations for sexual exploitation. It was not discussed, so child protection and safeguarding in a modern sense of our understanding of it was just wholly absent. And some well-intentioned practices appear quite outrageous to our 21st century eyes. So who today would send their children to a children's nudist camp, which was set up in the back of a retired army colonel's garden, or who would enter their adolescent children into a best physique competition submitting their naked photograph? They're quite unthinkable. And so depictions of nudist children appear in these kinds of publications without any discussion of children's vulnerability, without any discussions about their ability to provide consent or not. And in relation to the matter of agency, which is such a key concern of this network, children are almost always spoken on behalf of, even by child-centred educationalists. This is, of course, methodologically an issue with locating the child in history. And as the editors of that book on the left note, they say children are inherently less likely to be empowered to freely create the kinds of sources that historians might later consult in their research. And that was even the case in conditions that are apparently characterised by freedom. If we're taking Kimberly Reynolds' study of radical publishing for children into account, there weren't many studies in this text that are actually produced by children. They're produced for children. And there are no written or photographic contributions by children saying or showing how they felt about undress, although there is occasional evidence of children's engagement with nudist cultures as readers and photographers, as I'm showing you here. So this is an omission, but it's an omission for which we might be thankful because we live in completely different times. And indeed, we have lived in quite different times for quite some time already, where images of children, dressed or otherwise, have been subject to unprecedented scrutiny, including in excellent academic studies such as these. And in Pictures of Innocence, Anne Higgins put it in a statement that transfers well to historic nudist imagery. She says, "The most challenging pictures of children have been produced by a combined faith in the child's innocence and in the camera's neutrality." Now, British protection laws, child protection laws, have prohibited the showing of indecent child photographs since 1978. But whether nudism constitutes indecency has been a contentious point, not least in nudist publications, which are now very rightly very cautious about children's depiction. And yet parents today who participate in nudist practices with their children find themselves increasingly under attack, and some lament that there's in fact been a regression in attitudes. And this is from a 2019 issue of Health and Efficiency magazine, which is now called H&E Naturist, but it's the same magazine that's been going since 1900. And they argue in this article that to suggest naturism is not suited for children suggests that nudity is not suited for children, and they were concerned that children might instead seek out other sources, i.e. pornography, for bodily information. And these are arguments that are now 100 years old, but they take place now in a culture where children's bodies and children's clothes are highly sexualised, and children's nudity remains a really tricky topic to discuss. I can't, of course, resolve those 100 years of debate, but I'd like to close with a brief example of a recent publication, notably illustrated with illustrations rather than photographs. And this is by Rosie Haynes, and it's a book for children aimed at children 3 years plus. And I thought it had something in common, interestingly, with Helen Hancock's book, as was being discussed earlier. So instead of why do we wear clothes, it isn't rude to be nude. It also, I realise, has something in common because they both come out of museum locations, although one's out of the V&A and the other's out of Tate. Now, Haynes sees it isn't rude to be nude as part of a wider body positivity movement that gives children and their carers a place to gently discuss bodily acceptance. And I'll show you a page here by way of example, which is entitled All Bodies Are Wonderful. And it also gives children a space to discuss consent, because the final page is, and yours belongs to you. And the sticker on the front of the book says, contains nakedness, and that's okay, is a quiet revival of a discussion that nudists have been having for around 100 years about the need to normalise nudity under certain conditions for social progress. And the book overall, I think, provides a really nice way to consider that children have always got a central stake in that debate.